Hello everyone and welcome to this week's episode of the Aftermath series. Let us waste no time at all and dive right into this week's episode of Critical Role. So we begin this episode during the conversation that Essek and the party were having at the end of last episode, and ultimately this conversation concluded with no real new information coming about. Essek pretty much just rehashing and going over again what exactly is going on. Essek made it clear that he really does want to see an end to this conflict. However, both parties are in an understanding that the tensions between the two nations may not go away completely, as there's been shadow wars going on for the past several decades, and a definite end to this conflict is unlikely. So while the bloodshed will likely end, there will still be a continuation of these shadow wars. Essek also made it very clear that he does not want any harm to fall upon the party, and in order to make sure that doesn't happen, they need to be very careful to not let any other outside parties realize that the Mighty Nine is aware of what's going on, particularly the members of the Cerberus Assembly. Now, I am a bit worried that Ludinus Deleth might actually be scrying on this conversation, as Ludinus may have noticed that Essek was ushered out of the party, even though he was in his illusory form. Given how intelligent and clever Ludinus is, he may have suspected that something might be up and decided to scry on one of the members of the party. And if that's the case, there are likely to be consequences that will probably happen at the peace talks, but hopefully that doesn't happen. It's also very clear in this conversation that they were having that Caleb desperately wants to see Essek redeemed. Caleb clearly cares about Essek and doesn't want to see him fall into a similar pit that Caleb found himself in. So hopefully once this negotiations is passed, they can begin working towards helping Essek redeem himself. During this conversation, Ford and Jester decided to exit the ship and go back to the party to rescue Marion, so to speak. Upon arriving back to the party, Jester was once again reunited with her mother, and the three of them left the party, going back to the lavish chateau, where Ford and Jester shared a nice evening dinner, waiting for the party to return. Once the conversation concluded with Essek, the remaining members of the party met up with Jester and Ford at the lavish chateau, where they had a restful evening. And then in the morning, the party had a few days of downtime before the Armada is leaving for the peace talks. And so the various members of the party spent this time doing their own activities. Bo and Yasha spent their time in relative solitude, Bo spending her time having a nice little picnic on the beach by herself, while Yasha also spent her evenings alone on the beach practicing her bone harp. Veth spent her 2 days spending time with her family. Ford spent his time just relaxing in the wharf of Nicodranus, going back to his old days growing up in Port Damali. Caleb spent his time further tinkering with this collar that he had found in Halas's Happy Fun Ball, and he discovered that the collar is powered by some sort of arcane battery, a technology that's been lost since the Age of Arcanum. But there is a possible location where this arcane battery may reside, and that's in the northern reaches of Wildmount in Isocross. So maybe perhaps when all of this negotiations is said and done and TravelerCon is passed, perhaps the party will make a trek up north. Clay spent his downtime doing a little bit of shopping, where he purchased a necklace that will allow him to actually speak and converse with animals. He purchased a fan that, when used, casts gust of wind, I believe. And then he also purchased a mystery box that contained 2 scrolls, one of Flaming Sphere and the other of Telekinesis. And then, after these 2 days of downtime, the party and the Armada set off to the location where the negotiations will be taking place. And now that they are at sea, they have several days of downtime before they arrive at their destination. The party spent the first couple of days just relaxing. Jester spent her time crafting several statues of the Traveler for the other followers once TravelerCon comes around. Bo and Yasha both helped Jester sculpting some of these various statues, and they had a conversation while they were crafting these statues, and Jester sort of opened up about her feelings about this new revelation of the Traveler. She said she felt a little bit betrayed, which we sort of already knew, it was sort of hinted at previously, but she never really came out and said it. So it was just a nice conversation where Jester was reflecting on all of her emotions that she was feeling about the Traveler. And then Yasha opened up a little bit about how she's trying to overcome her guilt and what happened at the pit fights where she just let herself get totally beaten up. And Yasha pretty much just explained that it's going to take time for her to fully recover, but she feels that just being in the presence of the rest of the party will definitely help her recover. And also during this downtime, Ford and Caleb had a conversation, essentially reflecting on their time together and everything they've gone through. And then Caleb finally opened up to Ford about his past, revealing that Caleb killed his own family. And Caleb essentially explained how important this newfound family is to him, and how he desperately wants it to stay together and succeed. And they are both definitely showing some concerns about this peace talks coming up. But eventually their smooth sailing came to a relative end as a storm began to brew. Nothing too major, but just some heavy rain began to wash over the ocean. And it was during that evening of this storm that Yasha had a dream. A familiar setting where she's in the wastelands of Xhorhas, and there is a path before her. She walked this path and eventually came to a chasm that kept growing. And in order to stay on this path, she decided to attempt to jump this growing chasm. She fell short, however, and began to plummet down this chasm. Looking up at the clouded, stormy sky above her, she saw a pair of familiar, glowing eyes, and a voice called out to her, essentially telling her to prove herself. As she was falling, she unfurled her wings and began flying back up the chasm, and eventually reached the top and landed on the other side where she may continue down her path. And once she landed, she noticed that her wings were now feathered, and the voice called out once again, telling her that she was worthy, and she is still going to accomplish so much. This moment is definitely super important for Yasha. It will give her the confidence she needs to maybe finally forgive herself and take the necessary steps forward towards redeeming herself. But then Yasha wasn't the only one who had a dream that night. Ford also had a dream. He had a dream that he was lost in a similar jungle that they were just traversing when they were looking for the oasis for Caduceus. He wasn't sure which way to go, and so he summoned the Star Razor and tried to commune with the Wild Mother. However, when he tried to summon the Star Razor, he looked down and noticed that it wasn't the Star Razor that he had summoned. It was his old sword, the Sword of Fathoms, with a familiar, glowing yellow eye staring right back at him. And then he felt a pulsing pain in his chest that grew and grew. It became so painful that he woke up, and the pain carried over into the real world as standing before him was a deep scion, a twisted, mutated creature of the ocean, stabbing Ford in the chest with the Sword of Fathoms. And thus began an extremely intense, long, terrifying, anxiety-inducing battle as the Ball Eater was assaulted by various creatures of the deep. Absolute chaos ensued as there were so many layers to this battle. There was a battle that was happening above deck. There was a battle happening in the cargo hold, and a level below that. There was just so much chaos, so much going on. The party was completely split up. And during this battle, both Orly and Ford died. And as the final breath left Ford, the deep scion that had originally stabbed Ford in his sleep grabbed him and attempted to dimension door away. But thank goodness for a clutch counterspell by Caleb, this deep scion was unable to dimension door away. And eventually the party was able to defeat this deep scion and all of his various minions. But then, after all was said and done, they were left with the now still bodies of Ford and Orly. Luckily, I'm pretty sure the clerics do have revivify spells prepped and ready, but still an absolutely devastating battle. And it's very clear that Uk'otoa is not happy at all with Ford returning to his domain, and this was his first attempt at revenge and punishment for Ford's betrayal. Who knows what else is to come, but I can only assume it's not going to be good. And with all of that being said, we're going to wrap up. Let me know all of your thoughts, feelings, and emotions during that episode. It was absolutely insane. And it's looking like the peace talks may end up being our 100th episode, as the party does still have a few days left to travel to the peace talks. But it's probably more likely that the peace talks will take place on the 99th episode next week. But we'll just have to see what Matthew Mercer has planned for their next few days of travel. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I hope you all have an absolutely wonderful rest of your weekend, and I will see you all next week.